Modern technology has allowed us to achieve unprecedented capabilities, particularly in the field of forensics. However, in some cases, human actions remain a mystery, despite the fact that they can cost innocent lives. Typically, a crime has a motive, which police use to determine who could have attacked the victim and under what circumstances. But this was not always the case. Less than a century ago, what technology can do now could only be accomplished by our lesser brothers. Thanks to an animal, it was possible to solve one criminal case in a matter of minutes, which we will discuss today. Investigators had to rely on any leads and opportunities to track down the perpetrator. Debbie was born on October 23, 1955, in Greensboro, North Carolina, USA. She was the only child in a family that later moved to Hampton, Virginia. From an early age, the girl was described as purposeful and energetic, distinguished by her curiosity and courage. Debbie easily struck up conversations even with strangers, being remarkably sociable from a young age. Throughout her school years, Debbie constantly participated in performances and productions, feeling at ease on stage and enjoying the attention. Even in elementary school, she declared her desire to become a TV presenter. The girl had a well-trained voice, excellent diction, a pleasant appearance, and an attractive manner of communication. After graduating from high school, Debbie entered college, where she studied acting, wholly devoting herself to the profession in which she dreamed of making a career. But since prospects in this direction were not visible, in her youth, Debbie got a job on the radio, hoping to become an on-air host. Gradually, her talent was noticed, and she was offered to host her own live show. Of course, the girl also dreamed of a family but planned to deal with this only after getting on her feet. Unfortunately, things were not so cloudless on the romantic front. Debbie got burned time after time, trying to find her love. But finally, in 1986, she met a young man with whom a serious relationship began. In 1987, Debbie hosted a popular evening radio show that aired late at night. Every night she took calls, chatted with listeners, and entertained the audience, skillfully combining conversations with musical compositions. This format was in high demand at that time. Thanks to her charisma, kindness, and humor, the girl became a real star of the night air and a successful radio host. Having achieved certain heights on the radio, Debbie seriously thought about marriage and children. By that time, her beloved had already proposed to her, and they got married. Although the young woman received offers from other radio stations, she refused to switch, having achieved both financial success and real popularity in her field by 1987. Fortunately, in those days, Debbie could afford to remain unrecognized, working behind the scenes and not showing her face. Undoubtedly, this was extremely important from a security point of view, because popularity is not only the sincere affection of the public and smiles but also hatred that can lurk in the eyes of a random stranger. However, Debbie herself did not even think to hide her identity. Since her popularity skyrocketed, she did not betray her habits, remained active, and did not worry about confidentiality, attending various events where she openly declared who she really was. In the spring of 1987, it seemed Debbie's fears began to materialize. Once, during a live broadcast, she mentioned her fears of becoming a victim of a stalker or suffering violence from a stalker, but did not go into details about why she had such thoughts. The heroine of the story did not yet realize that popularity has a flip side. On that sunny day, 31-year-old Debbie, as usual, visited the Hampton Community Garden to relax and take care of the plants on her rented plot, not at all suspecting that something sinister might be lurking in the shade of the blooming greenery. At first, it was just an experiment, but later it turned into a pleasant hobby that she often engaged in during her free time from work, admitting that the garden had a calming effect on her. Here she felt truly cozy, enjoyed the tranquility, and indulged in her favorite pastime, growing vegetables, which became a source of peace of mind and comfort for her amidst nature. An alarming call rang out at the Hampton Police Department that day, May 9, 1987. A witness reported the discovery of a woman's body in a ditch in the community garden, noting that he had accidentally stumbled upon the deceased while passing by and could not identify her. He was literally in a panic when he called. Presumably, he had never seen such a thing in his life before. Arriving at the crime scene, The police found not only the lifeless body of the victim but also her car parked nearby. Documents found in the car helped establish the identity of the deceased. She turned out to be Debbie Dicus, a 31-year-old local resident. Detectives immediately drew attention to a possible sexual motive for the attack, as the woman's clothes were torn, although no other signs of rape were found. Debbie's car aroused particular interest, as traces of a struggle indicated that it was near the car that the confrontation between the victim and her tormentor began. Debbie's purse and personal belongings, including cash and documents, were left in the car, which immediately ruled out robbery as a possible motive for the crime. Despite desperate attempts to resist the attacker, all the efforts of the story's heroine were in vain. A few meters from Debbie's body, police found scattered items, as well as a piece of plastic that had broken off from an unknown object and did not belong to the victim's personal belongings. Detectives suggested that this fragment could have been left behind by the murder weapon used by the criminal, but additional data were needed to clarify the information, as it was impossible to state with certainty the origin of the plastic. It could have ended up there by chance. Within an hour after the investigators began working at the crime scene, an alarmed Bill Campbell, a young man who tried to pass through the cordoned-off zone but was detained by law enforcement officers, drove up to the garden. Bill, shocked by the news of Debbie's death, said that he was her fiancé, but his behavior immediately aroused suspicion among detectives, so they decided to interrogate him at the station. With tears in his eyes, Bill admitted that he had come to the garden because Debbie had been gone too long and he could not contact her, knowing that she loved to spend time there. He decided to personally check what had happened, not even suspecting that at that time his beloved was fighting for her life and lost this battle. It turned out that Bill, like Debbie, worked as a DJ on the radio. That's where they met, and later a romantic relationship began between them. The young man said that they planned to get married in a month, but now these dreams were shattered to smithereens. However, Bill was almost immediately excluded from the circle of suspects, as he had a reliable alibi. At the time of the attack, he was at home, which was confirmed by several witnesses who saw him there during that fatal time period. While examining the area near the place where Debbie's body was found, forensic experts managed to stumble upon a broken hoe, a tool with a heavy metal part that had been thrown into the bushes near the garden. To break it in half, as the police assumed, during the beating of the radio host, required a considerable effort. On the metal part of the hoe, experts found traces of blood with remnants of soft tissue and hair, which, according to detectives, belonged to the victim. Of course, the criminal's fingerprints should have been left on the tool's handle. Meanwhile, investigators actively communicated with people who lived near the garden, hoping that someone might have noticed a suspicious person who attacked Debbie in broad daylight. Among the first witnesses was a woman who spoke about a young, light-haired man. According to the witness, she lived in a neighboring house, the windows of which overlooked the garden, where the famous host was often seen. When Debbie came there, one of the local residents often watched her, Michael Lapper, a laborer at the cemetery located across the road. He always seemed strange, was unsociable, and generally looked suspicious. The police immediately became interested in this guy, but they could not find him. There was even a suggestion that he had fled, but during the check, it turned out that Michael was not in the city on the day of the murder, so he was excluded from the list of suspects. Unfortunately, interviewing local residents did not provide any new leads. After that, the investigators focused on checking the version with the attack of an inadequate radio listener who, for some reason, might have wanted to take revenge on Debbie. The calls to the radio station that came in during the work of the story's heroine were carefully studied, but this direction also did not bring any new leads. Neither on the air nor at work in general did Debbie receive any threats. At least, the young woman herself did not complain about such episodes, and other employees of the radio company, relatives, and her fiancé confirmed that she did not have problems with enemies, was not associated with crime, and did not suffer from addictions. The radio host was the last person one could suspect of being involved in criminal reports. Approximately an hour before the police arrived at the scene of the tragedy, as the forensic expert found out by analyzing the condition of the deceased's eyes and the absence of cadaveric spasm, Debbie gave her soul to God. Initially, it was assumed that death occurred 3 to 4 hours before the arrival of police officers, but thanks to the testimony of Debbie's fiancé, Bill, who was able to indicate the time when she left home, it was possible to narrow down the time intervals. While the autopsy report was being compiled, law enforcement officers tried to find out if a potentially dangerous person could have been in Debbie's environment. Given the young woman's popularity among radio listeners and the particular cruelty with which the massacre was committed, investigators suggested that the attacker could have been one of the host's haters. John Barker, a friend of Debbie's and a fellow radio host, spoke with the police. The man recalled that shortly before her death, the girl had mentioned her fears for her own life, but at that moment he did not even take these words seriously. John confirmed the absence of any prerequisites for such statements. Debbie never told whether it was just a premonition, whether she was being stalked, or whether someone could threaten her. When Debbie's body ended up on the forensic expert's table, the full extent of the attacker's brutality was revealed. On the woman's back, there was a mysterious bruise of unknown origin, which clearly indicated a strong impact with a heavy object. It seemed that the victim had suffered several powerful blows that led to a spinal injury. Deep lacerated wounds were visible on Debbie's head, which in themselves could pose a danger to life. The scalp was torn off in a large area of the skull, exposing the bone. There were signs of strangulation on the radio host's neck, but the real cause of death turned out to be drowning. Water was found in the victim's lungs. Debbie's clothes were torn, obviously in an attempt by the criminal to humiliate her, which, according to detectives, was the result of hatred. The absence of any traces of rape spoke volumes about the killer, who, according to investigators, should be sought among the young woman's acquaintances. A dog handler with his specially trained dog, Rodie, was invited to track down the criminal by scent, hoping that the dog would be able to lead the police to new clues. Although investigators were interested in fingerprints on the broken hoe found near the place where Debbie's body was discovered, they were not found there. The killer probably used gloves or simply wiped off the traces. However, detectives believed that this did not prevent the criminal's scent from remaining on the garden tool. In those years, law enforcement officers did not have such a wide arsenal for studying evidence and searching for criminals, so they had to rely on techniques such as odorology, the science of smells. Although in some countries it is considered insufficiently accurate, this does not negate the fact that a dog's sense of smell can be 40 times more sensitive than a human's. Of course, much depends on the dog used, but in this case, it was a German Shepherd named Rodie with an impressive track record. Meanwhile, as the dog handler and detectives worked at the murder scene, a large crowd of onlookers gathered around, watching the investigation with interest. They paid particular attention to how the dog was given a sniff of the broken hoe handle, and the dog handler immediately perked up, noticing that the animal was behaving as if it sensed the criminal's scent somewhere nearby. At first, the dog headed towards Debbie's car, thoroughly sniffed it, and then moved towards the crowd. There he focused his attention on one young man, dressed in dirty clothes, jeans, and a t-shirt stained with grass. After carefully sniffing this person, Rodie barked, signaling that he had found the source of the scent. This guy turned out to be none other than the same witness who had turned to the police, claiming that he had found Debbie's body in a ditch in the community garden. The main suspect in the murder of the radio host was 21-year-old Ronald Blanchard, who had recently married and worked on a fishing boat in the local port. The young man insisted on his innocence in Debbie's death, claiming that he was not acquainted with her and therefore could not have any motive for the attack. However, as they spoke with the young man, the police became more and more convinced of his guilt. Ronald was visibly nervous, confused in his testimony, and took a long time to consider his answers. The longer the conversation lasted, the more the story of the person who called the police changed. At first, Ronald insisted that he did not know Debbie and had not heard about her work on the radio, but later he let slip that he was aware of all this. However, to justify his lie, he referred to some friend from the crowd who allegedly told him a brief biography of the victim. However, the friend mentioned by the main suspect did not confirm that he was at the crime scene that day at all. By all parameters, Ronald Blanchard fit the role of a killer. He had a dubious past. Back in high school, from which he was expelled, the guy was noticed in connections with the criminal world. Having never received a full education, Ronald made do with occasional earnings until he got a job as a laborer in the local port. And there he was known as an arrogant and hot-tempered person who always provoked problems. It was not for nothing that his parents called Ron a problem child. Ronald's bad temper was the reason for his numerous minor skirmishes with the law. At the slightest opportunity, he easily lost his temper, started fights, and generally behaved extremely unpredictably, which made him an ideal candidate for the role of a socially dangerous element capable of a brutal murder. As the investigation found out, after the attack on Debbie Dicus, the criminal returned home with bloody hands and dirty clothes. His young wife, alarmed by her husband's appearance, calmed down after hearing the story that he had found the body of a murdered woman and got dirty while trying to help her. She believed Ronald, since he immediately called 911 after that. During the interrogation, the main suspect, Ronald Blanchard, claimed that he had never seen or touched any hoe. According to him, having discovered Debbie's body, he immediately checked her pulse and realized that she was dead. He explained the appearance of dirt on his clothes by pulling the victim out of the ditch. There was no phone nearby, so he went home, from where he called the police. His story might have seemed plausible if it weren't for one detail. Law enforcement officers checked the clothes Ronald was wearing while standing in the crowd of onlookers and found traces of blood on his shirt, both front and back. The suspect justified the appearance of the stains by the same pulling of the victim out of the ditch, but could not convincingly explain the traces on his back. The killer insisted that he had to press the body of the deceased against himself in order to pull her out. However, according to forensic experts, the splashes on the young man's back could only appear as a result of using the hoe. When he raised it above his head for the next blow, already bloody, the drops simply flowed down his back. To analyze the pattern left by the drops of blood, forensic experts conducted an experiment. They took a motorcycle helmet that imitated the victim's skull and covered it with fabric on the outside. By striking with a hoe, the experts were able to obtain a pattern on the fabric of the lab clothes similar to the one on the suspect's shirt. These facts became convincing evidence of his guilt. Despite the persuasiveness of the evidence, according to the forensic expert, Debbie was beaten with two different types of weapons. The hoe left deep lacerated wounds on her head, but in addition, there were clear traces of blows with a blunt heavy object on the woman's body. The impact was so intense that it led to a spinal injury. During a search of the suspect's car and apartment, police found an old air rifle in poor condition in his pickup truck. By his own admission, Ronald often used it for hunting birds. Ballistic experts noticed a bent barrel, a dented bolt, and a chip on the barrel. A piece of polymer found at the murder scene exactly matched the broken-off part of the rifle. It became obvious that the criminal had beaten Debbie using the air rifle as a bat. A characteristic bruise remained on the young woman's back from a powerful blow, similar to a shoulder rest. During the examination of the rifle, forensic experts also found several hairs with follicles that matched the victim's hair color and length. At that time, DNA testing technology was still in its infancy and was hardly used. Innovative techniques were first used to solve cases only in the mid-80s, actually shortly before the incident with Debbie. Over those few years, the principle had changed little, and the biggest problem was the need to obtain a large amount of material for research. If there was too little, the method did not work. But in the case of Debbie Dicus, there were more than enough samples for the examination. In laboratory conditions, it was possible to compare the found evidence and thus link Ronald Blanchard to the murdered radio host, proving his involvement in this brutal crime. The defendant, Ronald Blanchard, refused to testify on his own behalf during the trial, which began on October 27, 1988, 7 months after he managed to be released on bail. He insisted on his innocence, showing no remorse or pangs of conscience, and behaved arrogantly and offensively towards the family of the murdered radio host Debbie Dicus. According to the prosecution, Ronald took Debbie's remark to heart, which she made to him during a chance meeting shortly before the tragedy. Then, during a walk, the radio host encountered her future killer when he was hunting birds with a rifle and expressed her indignation that the guy was just killing animals. She did not suspect that by standing up for our lesser brothers, she herself would end up in the sights of a killer. Seeing Ronald in person, Debbie's boyfriend suspected that this was the very man with whom she had a conflict. He was very similar to Ron in description. Thus, the detectives obtained a possible motive for the criminal, hiding the insult. He decided to take revenge. The prosecutor's office believed that Ronald managed to track down his victim when she once again came to take care of the plants in the community garden. Taking a rifle from his car, he attacked Debbie and hit her in the back with the butt. However, the criminal's strength was not enough to knock the story's heroine off her feet, and she tried to escape. Then Ron dealt another blow to her back, and this time Debbie fell. Obviously, the attacker intended to rape his victim, but could not cope with her, since Debbie put up a serious resistance that he did not expect. Enraged by the resistance, Ronald grabbed a hoe that was simply lying nearby and used in the garden, and began to beat the victim on the head with it until she lost consciousness. As a result of this brutal massacre, his clothes were splattered with blood, and traces of grass on his knees and t-shirt appeared when the thug drowned Debbie in a dish. According to the prosecution, Ronald's call to the police was connected with his confession to his wife. When she caught her husband with bloody hands, he made up an explanation on the spot, but in order not to arouse suspicion, he was forced to continue his lie and still call the police. In fact, the killer was simply guided by the situation, trying with all his might to cover his tracks. Ronald's financial situation was assessed as bankrupt. His fortune amounted to only $597. So when the judge set bail at about $130,000, a group of his supporters were able to raise this money for the criminal. The dog nicknamed Rodie, who unerringly identified the killer of Debbie Dicus, Ronald Blanchard, later built a real career in the fight against crime. His path began with training at a special dog academy, after which the German Shepherd took part in more than 700 cases of criminal investigations, as well as numerous search and rescue operations. Back in 1984, Rodie was recognized as the best service dog in the state of Virginia. Later, this four-legged hero retired and passed away in 1989 at the age of 9. For almost 2 decades after the sentencing, Ronald Blanchard continued to insist on his innocence until he finally changed his testimony in 2006. All this time, the criminal spent behind bars and only now officially addressed the family of his victim with apologies, saying that he sincerely repents of what he did. 10 years after the start of his imprisonment, Ron tried to appeal the verdict, insisting that the DNA testing methodology at the time of the investigation was too poorly developed and had a large margin of error, so he asked for the case to be reviewed. The defendant's lawyer pointed out errors in the work of the investigation and believed that bringing charges only on the basis of a dog's reaction was a clear sign of bias. The appeal was accepted, and new examinations were carried out. By that time, technology had taken a significant step forward, so a reanalysis of all the collected materials only confirmed that it was Ronald Blanchard who was the killer of Debbie Dicus. The second trial, together with the sentencing, took only 24 hours, and nothing changed for the criminal. The punishment remained in force. On April 8, 1988, Ronald Blanchard was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison without the right to parole plus another 12 years. The victim's father, Mark Dicus, stated then that Ron deserved the electric chair. At that time, the death penalty was in effect in Virginia, which was carried out either through the electric chair or through a lethal injection. The defendant himself could choose the method of execution, but in Debbie's case, the death penalty was not considered, since the rape was not carried through to the end. Despite the fierce defense of the lawyer, the prosecutors managed to convince the jury of Ronald Blanchard's guilt. In many ways, this became possible thanks to the results of DNA analysis and a whole series of circumstantial evidence. In the end, he was found guilty of first-degree murder, as well as attempted rape. The attack with the use of a firearm was taken into account as an aggravating circumstance, although he did not use it for its intended purpose. The defendant's wife did not believe in his guilt until the very end. She remained convinced that a miscarriage of justice had occurred, and Ron could not have killed a person in any way. After the verdict was announced, the grief-stricken woman cried and begged the court to allow her to hug her husband one last time. The jurors perceived Ronald Blanchard's refusal to testify on his own behalf as a fear of blurting out and exposing himself. His defiant behavior in the courtroom, lack of remorse and pangs of conscience, as well as an offensive attitude towards the family of the murdered radio host also did not play in favor of the defendant. The story of the murder of young radio host Debbie Dicus is a tragic example of how one moment of thoughtless cruelty can destroy not only the life of the victim but also forever change the fate of her relatives, friends, and everyone who knew and loved her. This girl had a brilliant future ahead of her. She was full of dreams and plans, But all this was mercilessly cut short by the hand of an insidious killer. Debbie died defending her right to life, honor, and dignity. She fought to the end, not giving up, and although her physical strength was not enough to overcome the armed attacker, her courage and indomitable spirit will forever remain an example for all of us. The bright memory of Debbie Dicus will live in the hearts of those who knew her, and may the earth rest lightly upon her. The disclosure of this terrible crime became possible thanks to the persistent and professional work of investigators, forensic experts, and everyone who joined the search for the truth. I especially want to note the invaluable contribution of the shepherd dog Rodie, a real four-legged hero, whose keen sense of smell and impeccable intuition made it possible to track down the killer and bring him to justice. Rodie is a vivid representative of those dedicated and intelligent animals that faithfully serve people, helping to solve the most intricate crimes and save lives. Such dogs are true professionals in their field, and we should be infinitely grateful to them for their service. Rodie and his colleagues are worthy descendants of the legendary police dogs of the past, whose successes and achievements have gone down in the history of criminology. May the memory of Rodie, who, unfortunately, is no longer with us, be forever preserved as a symbol of loyalty, courage, and dedication. And may his example inspire new generations of service dogs and their mentors' dog handlers to perform their duty just as conscientiously and devotedly, protecting law and justice. The Debbie Dicus case also makes us think about how important it is to recognize potential danger in time and take all possible measures for self-defense. After all, as we can see, even in a seemingly safe and familiar environment, a mortal threat can lurk. Therefore, each of us should be vigilant, cautious, and always listen to our inner sense of alarm. If you find yourself in an unfamiliar place or situation that makes you feel uneasy, leave this area as soon as possible and move to where you will feel protected. Do not be ashamed to ask for help if you feel that you are in danger. Contact relatives, friends, law enforcement officers. Make sure that someone close to you always knows where you are and when you should return. Learn basic self-defense techniques. Carry self-defense tools allowed by law. Do not enter into conflicts with aggressively minded people, especially if you feel that you will not be able to give them a worthy rebuff. Remember, your life and health are above all, and for the sake of their preservation, it is not worth risking entering into a confrontation with a criminal. And most importantly, be attentive to other people. Do not be indifferent to someone else's trouble. If you witness a crime or see something suspicious, immediately report it to the police. Your caring and active citizenship can save someone's life and help prevent a tragedy like the one that took Debbie Dicus' life. Let this sad story be a reminder to all of us of how fragile human life is and how much every action of ours matters. May it teach us to value every moment spent with loved ones and never forget that true happiness lies in love, mercy, and mutual assistance. And may the memory of Debbie Dicus and all the innocently lost victims of crimes forever remain in our hearts, prompting us to make this world kinder, safer, and more humane.